to get to the meat. I went home last week and I told my wife, I said, I think this is going to turn out to be one of my favorite times in the week for a couple of reasons. Number one, I really respect the intellect and the experience that's here among you all. And two, the intellectual curiosity. So we're not, I mean, I guess it's appropriate to this audience. We're not just doing baby law, okay? We're going to get into some meat and really wrestle with some meaty issues, but do it in a real way. I also have to ask your forgiveness today. I don't look like a law professor. I'm flying to University of Michigan today, so I use my travel duds. So don't stone me, okay? Next week, if you want, I'll look like a law professor. So just to review, and if you'll notice, I said this last week, but you know, a picture's worth 1,000 words. Last week I said, don't ever use the phrase collateral damage, because that's what you see in the media. It's wrong, it's inaccurate, it betrays people who really don't understand the law. Okay? So notice, there's the picture. Don't use it. It's got that big red line ironed out. Just to review a little bit, military necessity, the concept that everything we do has an articulable, very specific military purpose. Okay? Which, and we'll come back to this in a few minutes as we do targeting and human shields today. And at the end, we're going to do something democratic. I'm considering switching classes, so I'm going to ask you all your opinion, and then we'll roll. Unnecessary suffering, last week I said you don't have to worry about that. That's really the archaic principle that was designed to say that you, for example, you cannot put glass fragments in exploding landmines because they don't show up on X-rays, right? So things that are intentionally designed and employed to cause unnecessary suffering. A lot of lay people get confused by that concept because they say, well, wait a minute, here's two weapons, one of which really wouldn't hurt you, the other ones would hurt you, so you must use the one that wouldn't hurt you because to do otherwise betrays an intent to cause unnecessary suffering. How dumb would that be? Seriously, how dumb would it be if the rule was you have to use the weapon that won't actually hurt you? Right? So that's not the law. The law says you can't intentionally use a weapon designed to cause unnecessary suffering. Meaning, you know, that's the basis of the old rule. For example, anybody that was an infantryman in the Rangers, you can't take a file and file down your rounds, for example, to make them work in a way that they're not ballistically designed to do. Okay? Not really a problem in today's world in ways for the reasons that we're using. Even the bad guys don't have time and energy to do those kinds of things, or the technology. The big one, the big two really, distinction and proportionality. Distinction, the principle that, and I showed you this last week on a slide, at all times, under all circumstances, you must always distinguish between the civilian population and combatants, okay, and between civilian property and combatant property. Now, combatant, to go back to John's question, remember, combatancy, a concept exclusively reserved for conflicts between states. Anybody remember the reason why? We're all reviewing to catch up and let people get parked. Combatancy only between states. Anybody remember why? Because when you are a combatant, a real combatant, as bestowed from the law, you get rights and benefits from international law. So you get, the right you get is the right to kill people. What do we do with a combatant who kills lots of people? We put a silver star on their chest and we hold parades and we name parks after them and all of that. What do we do with a normal civilian person that kills lots of people? Obviously, very different. It's that combatant's privilege that gives you the right to do that. Of course, as you know, the Spider-Man movie, along with great rights come great responsibilities, right? So on the flip side of that, you may target a combatant, he may target or she may target and engage, but on the flip side, they are targetable just based on their status, not based on anything they are doing, just based on their status because they are a combatant. Remember I said this last week, you can kill a combatant when they're in their pajamas. Good time to do it, they can't shoot back. You know, you can kill them when they're home on leave because you're targeting them based, you know, think about it. If we find General Yodel home on leave in World War II, can we kill him then? Absolutely. Why? Because he's a combatant. See? That rule flips, of course, when you become a non-combatant, right? When you're sick and wounded, there's a whole set of legal protections for you. When you surrender, you're now a prisoner of war. That's distinction. binding, and the Yugoslavia Tribunal in the Kapreskic case said that distinction is the bedrock of the law of war, and I agree with that. That's the core principle. This entire body of law exists to protect civilians, okay, and those who are not affiliated with the hostilities to greater or lesser degrees. And then proportionality. I hope some of y'all buy the book. I'm not going to make a dime off of it, but there's a whole lot more detail in there. So the Proportionality in International Law book, proportionality is the modern principle that touches everything we do. Cyber war. Who was interested in cyber war last week? Ask me. A couple of people. Oh, we're going to do cyber war. There's a whole chapter on cyber war in the book. I kept waiting when the North Koreans started hacking Sony. I kept waiting on this dumb White House press spokesperson to stand up and say, I'm not going to explain this, just read chapter 11 of Professor Newton's book. You know? It's there. You know? And because when we're dealing with North Korea, we got the law wrong for detailed reasons. So that chapter explains cyber war, and some of that we're going to do in here. All right, a couple of quick questions, and then we'll get loaded. You're now fully engaged, and everybody's basically here and parked. A couple of quick questions, and I'm going to come to John's question. He already asked me his question. He's right, but I know a bunch of other people are wondering it. Anybody? Going once, going twice? Everybody happy? Yes. Is life good? Cell phones are off, man. We're happy. Floating in a sea of technicality. All right, so here's where we are. We're going to do targeting today. I'm thinking, when we get to the end, I could easily do either or. I'm thinking, and I'll let y'all vote on it, whether we do human rights and laws and customs next week, or we flip it and we just do drones next week. Those are rather fungible in some ways, but it just depends on how y'all feel, how your mood is at the end of the day. I hope you're in a good mood at the end of the day. But then we'll decide, and I'll let y'all vote. And then we're going to do coalition warfare. And in the end, we'll do the grab bag. I know a bunch of y'all are interested in the accountability mechanisms. How do we prosecute this stuff? And so we'll talk about that at the very end, among other things, whatever y'all want to talk about. All right, so here we are. And we'll see if this works. And you tell me what's wrong with this, if anything. Oh. Beats me. Those are the shades. How about that? There you go. All right, so link's not going to work. Dadgummit, it worked earlier. So imagine this fella, little rifleman right there, right? Little sniper. Pretend he's Al-Qaeda or Al-Shabaab. What's your favorite terrorist group? They all have, okay, so this is an ISIS guy, okay? Let's pretend he's from Australia. So we got an Aussie ISIS. I just like the alliteration of that, actually. So we've got an Aussie ISIS, and we find this guy, and never mind, we don't have boots on the ground, but let's assume we did, and we launch a Hellfire missile at this guy. Hellfire missile, and he just explodes. He's gone. Now, does that bother anybody? Why? All right, good. Number one, we kind of need to understand what our environment is looking like, what those buildings are. Good. What else? Do we know who he is? Doesn't matter. Do we need to know who he is? If we know he's ISIS. Okay, good. She's a very clever woman. What's your name? Arlene. Arlene is hinting at something very important. Remember, we're already complying with the principle of distinction, right? We know this is a fighter. Does anybody think that's not a fighter? Anybody think that's just an innocent civilian? I don't think so. Okay. In the active conduct of hostilities, right? Leaning around the corner doing that. But then the question is, and I'm going to ask somebody in a minute why this is relevant. Arlene's point is very pertinent. Who is he? In other words, if it's the leader of ISIS himself, why does that matter as opposed to a regular rifleman? Yes, sir.
Because the higher value of a leader, taking out a leader, is justified in use of a higher level.
Why? Why would, and I'll say it again, did everybody hear what he said? The taking out of let me put it in legal terms. Can I put it in professor speak? Professor speak says the military advantage anticipated by killing a higher ranked leader would lawfully permit much higher levels of what? What are we comparing here? Not force. Not levels of force. Good. Damage to what? Somebody needs to write a book on the law of proportionality. This is the proportionality principle. See, we are not weighing the amount of force he's using versus the amount of force we use against him. Because if we did that, we would turn the law of war into sporting events. Right? We'd have zebra stripes out here and we'd say, time out. Excessive force, we would have people with calipers. Any accountants in here? Right? We would have accountants and calipers out there and measuring, well, the blast effect of your weapon is this, the blast effect of my weapon is this, that's unfair, stop, can't do. That is not the law of war. What we're measuring here, this is Arlene's insight, even though she didn't articulate it fully. If I'd given her more time, she would have. Is we're not measuring the relative amounts of force. What we're measuring is, in the proportionality principle, what we do, the military advantage anticipated, versus, y'all said it, damage to what? Not just surrounding areas, people, civilian people, or civilian property. That's what we're measuring. And I promise you, this is a very common mistake. You'll see it in op-eds all the time. Now, there is just a little teaser for you. When we do the law of human rights, I will tell you why, as a technical matter, that commensurate weighing is not entirely inappropriate. I mean, that's our morality. That's kind of our moral instincts, right? I know we had an old philosophy professor in here. Where's he hiding? There's a philosophical basis to this. Okay? But it's not the law of war. Okay? And in about 3 weeks, I'll tell you where that does come from in the law. All right. Everybody with me? Everybody happy? Good. So here we go. The jus ad bellum versus jus in bello. I showed you this last week, but I want to frame it for you. The instinct that says we have to measure the amount of force being used versus the amount of force we use, that comes from philosophy. It comes from Grotius and Vittorio and all the Suarez, all the classic philosophers. But it's rooted today in the law of jus ad bellum. Think about it. What that does is it erects a barrier to warfare. We don't just lightly enter into warfare, do we? We don't go into warfare anytime we want to. Jus ad bellum says you may only go to war or use military force when you are proportionately responding to a threat. Now, how do we gauge proportionality under jus ad bellum? We may use roughly the commensurate amount of force necessary to eliminate the threat. See, there's where we're measuring the force we're using versus the force we're trying to stop. Everybody see that? When ISIS says, we will kill one American tourist in Paris, we don't destroy Paris to try to stop that person. Jus ad bellum would say, no, wait, that's disproportionate. But in that body of law, and the reason is very important, because we're trying to create, in the legal field, a barrier to armed conflict. You can't just go to war anytime you want to, right? In Benjamin Franklin's words, we don't want a president who is overly fond of war. Once we are in an armed conflict, however, it flips, and so all the bodies of law we've been talking about becomes relevant. So now we're talking about a same word, proportionality, very different application of proportionality. Okay? And in a minute we're going to do conduits, and I'm going to show you how that works. This is the way it works graphically. By the way, I have to pause for a second. Show of hands, how many folks got the slides and an email hot link I emailed out to y'all? Stand back while I throw something. I left class last week. I said, here are the slides. Please mail them to people. Here's a hot link. Here's an article they should read, blah, blah, blah. Nobody got that? I am just disgusted. Where's the lady that runs Osher? Where did she go? Somebody email her and say, hey, where's my slides? Because Professor Newton sent them to you.
Don't use excessive force.
I won't. To be correct, I will only use that degree of force necessary to eliminate the problem, which is both morally and legally appropriate, I think anyway. But seriously, I'll make sure you get these slides. I did it last week. I don't know why y'all didn't get them. Her insight to me, and I'm sort of asking y'all, I'm getting to know y'all a little bit, Her insight to me was, though, that y'all are really smart and that you like additional reading. So last week I sent you an extra little hot link of an article that would have explained all of this stuff nicely for you coming in the gate. So I'll continue to do that, give you some links and some extra stuff. If you got time, if you don't worry about it. Okay? All right, so here's what this looks like graphically. And if you'd read the article I sent you, you would get a much better grasp of this, which is just to say, understand that at the baseline level here, when we're talking about these core issues, there are some things that transcend. Remember, jus ad bellum, peace. We're in time of peace. Jus ad bellum is the bridge or the link that carries us from time of peace to time of war. Once we're in war, we're above the line here applying all this law of war stuff. Okay? But there's some bodies of law that underpin all of this. Okay? I hate the word undergird. It's not really a word. It reminds me of a support garment. There's some bodies of law, though, that underpin all of this. For example, the law of genocide will apply at all times. Time of peace, time of war, all these technical, legal, not relevant. Genocide is genocide is genocide. We're going to punish it. Crimes against humanity. Okay? The law of torture. When we say use Kogan's norms, it's a fancy way for saying the body, the core principles of law that we all agree with under all circumstances. So it doesn't matter whether we're in time of war or time of peace or where we are in that spectrum. There's no lawful justification for full-blown torture. Okay? That's that bottom bedrock layer. Okay? I'm sorry? I'm sorry, I don't understand the question. How old are the rules? That's the word, how old? Oh, listen. Oh, boy. You want another Osher course? The history of this stuff goes back thousands and thousands and thousands of years. The black letter rules are still evolving to this day. But I could show you the roots of these principles. Gosh, I've got a Roman commander talking about how you treat prisoners of war. I've got, thousands and thousands. You think about it. Let's just do some common sense here. If you're a military commander in the Roman legion fighting the Gauls, and you win a battle or you're beginning to win a battle and everybody stops to loot, what happens to your military efficiency? You got no discipline, no efficiency. Well, I'm a Roman commander. What I say is the law. I'm not going to do that. Right? So I say to my Roman legionnaires, which is what they did, among other things, and this goes back even before then. The Greeks, the Romans, there's stuff in the Bible. I could show you biblical passages. Okay? There's the Roman legionnaire, your question, John, about the difference between combatants and non-combatants. Roman legionnaires say, it is not lawful for anyone to fight without the approval of the emperor. Anyone who fights without the approval of the emperor, today we would call an unprivileged belligerent, okay, or an unlawful participant, or a civilian, let's just be honest, or a terrorist, is to be put to death. Now, we wouldn't do that today for other legal reasons, but you see the point. This distinction between lawful combatants and unprivileged participants, thousands and thousands of years. Okay? That's how old this stuff is. Whole separate Osher course for me to give you the history. Well, they do change. They change all the time. How many folks are, I get this question all the time. People say, well, boy, the law of war is really messed up because the Allies firebombed Dresden in World War II. How many folks think that? Well, guess what? The law changed. In those days, I could draw a circle on a map and say, that's the target. And that was the target. Tokyo, the Tokyo firebombings, the Dresden firebombings, other places that we did that in World War II. The law changed in 1977 and said, no, you have to disaggregate those targets and do a separate proportionality distinction, a separate whole legal analysis. You can never, see, the law does change. But the core principles, thousands and thousands and thousands of years. Okay? The point here is very simple, which is to say that, this is John's question, when I'm fighting an international armed conflict between two states and all of this body of law applies, pretty straightforward. But what's the law? There's the law. It's written down, and we can apply the conventions, and we do that based on state versus state violence. Very straightforward. Okay? When we are fighting an armed conflict, though, as we tend to fight now, where it's between a state and a non-state actor, the Nigerians fighting Al-Shabaab, the French in Mali fighting Al-Shabaab, You know, you could go on and on and on and on and on with all the terrorist groups. Non-state actors, that big blue arrow, is that blue or gray or whatever it is, shows you that the principles transpose even when the law doesn't directly apply. Okay, so this is John's question. John asked me earlier, he said, well, why are we responsible for complying with all this law when they don't? Answer, because we're bound. In an international armed conflict, we're bound by the treaties. We're bound by the law technically. In a non-international armed conflict, we're either bound by the relevant treaties, there's some relevant treaties, there's just not very many, okay, or we're bound by what we call customary international law. And that is non-negotiable. It is very well settled. So I want you to understand, the law I'm going to give you comes from this international armed conflict side. It comes from this side over here. Okay? It's treaty law, it's black letter, I could show it to you if you wanted. But in the kinds of things we're doing, when we go target ISIS, we're way down here. Okay? When we're targeting ISIS or Al-Shabaab or any other terrorist group. Okay? Now, John's question. You got a question, John?
Well, yes.
You look like you had a question.
Yes. Yes, the question that I asked you was, who gets to be a combatant?
Yeah.
If anybody just runs out and says, I'm a combatant, so I get to shoot and kill.
Right.
You know.
Y'all want to diverge at John's request? Can we take a little detour? We're going to humor John because I'm going to answer that question in great detail the next couple of weeks, but it's useful. He's a smart guy. He's anticipating the real core issue, which we're about to get into. The issue is, who's a combatant and who's not a combatant? So this is Common Article 3. I'm going to answer your question, John. Just give me a chance to explain why it's relevant. Common Article 3 there, imagine the entire Geneva Conventions. Lots of law. I mean, I could bring you dog piles of law. Okay? I could make a 4-foot stack of law. That's all that law applicable on that right side of that line. International armed conflicts. When we did the Geneva Conventions, though, there's one tiny little provision applicable to all conflicts, particularly the armed conflicts, as we say, not of an international character, meaning state versus non-state actor. Okay? Common Article 3 is the thing that bears the weight of that. This is Common Article 3. You can read it. It's very basic human rights law. So due process rights, outrages on personal dignity, cruel, humiliating, and degrading treatment. For example, when American service members put underwear on insurgents in Iraq, that's a violation of Common Article 3, in addition to being other chargeable offenses. Okay? Because it's just humiliating. In Panama, we told a Panamanian colonel that we had pictures of him with little girls, which was a lie, and that we would put them on the internet. That's humiliating and degrading. Okay? Taking of hostages. And then the big one, violence to life and person, murder, mutilation, cruel treatment, and torture. That's Common Article 3. Now, those rules are the baseline at all times. And here's the key. This is the beginning of the answer to John's question. Those rules apply, in the language of the treaty, to persons who are not taking an active part in hostilities. Okay? If you're taking an active part in hostilities, how dumb would it be to have a rule that said, I can't use violence against you? Right? So here's the principle. Understand this. When I'm a civilian and I choose to take an active part in hostilities, who's responsible for taking away my protections? Me. See? Because I've chosen to actively participate in hostilities. All right? So the Common Article 3 threshold is active participation in hostilities. On the other side of this line, everything we're talking about is a bifurcated class of people. You're either a combatant or you're not. So John's question was, how do you get to be a combatant? The Geneva Conventions, Article 4, Third Geneva Convention, Article 4, if you're a geek, sort of research geek, and you don't believe me, you want to see it for yourself, look up the Third Geneva Convention, the Geneva Convention for the Protection of Prisoners of War, Article 4, Paragraph 4. And you'll see it. Article 4 of the Third Geneva Convention is the law I'm about to give you. This is the answer to John's question. Who gets to be a combatant? The armed forces of a state, period, under all circumstances. That's why we can target General Yodel when he's home on leave. He's a combatant. He's the armed forces of a state. We target him based on that status. Okay? We can target as a combatant persons who are accompanying the force, meaning in World War II, for example, logisticians. You know, you had some civilian, the Norden bomb site, you had some engineers out there that were civilians, but they carried ID cards. They were incorporated into the course, paid by the federal government. For law of war purposes, those people are combatants. Okay? And then the big one, which is still controversial in modern international law, when we did the Geneva Conventions in 1949, we were trying to pick up the French resistance fighters. If you're a French resistance fighter fighting in World War II, what are you? Are you a combatant? Nope. You're a civilian unlawfully participating in hostilities. Now our moral sensitivity says, wait a minute, wait a minute, wait a minute. They've been occupied by the Germans. They got every right, lawfully, but they didn't have it lawfully, so we took care of that in the Third Geneva Convention. In the Third Geneva Convention, even if you're a civilian or some insurgent group, you may be a combatant if you are incorporated into the armed forces and you meet 4 big criteria. The big 4, you probably heard these. Okay? And I'm going to tell you these, and then you tell me, when can a terrorist group qualify as a combatant? Any terrorist group. First criteria is you have to carry your arms openly. You have to carry your arms openly. Okay? Second criteria, you have to wear a fixed and distinctive insignia. Fixed and distinctive insignia. Now, intellectually, put those two together. Why are those two the rules, the first 2 rules? Carrying your arms openly, so I've got my weapons. Fixed and distinctive insignia, why are those the baseline rules? Anybody? Or everybody? Why do I have to identify them? Yeah, come on. Distinction, good. Principle of distinction, the bedrock of this entire body of law, because we're trying to make those participants stand out from civilians. That's the first 2 big ones. The third one is that group has an organized chain of command. In other words, there's some discipline, there's some way of controlling. It's not just a mob, it's not just a gang or some criminal organization. There's an organized fighting structure. And then the most important one, they have a professed willingness to comply with the laws and customs of war. So they're quasi-military, they're in the military, they've been incorporated, but they're not. So even though they're still technically civilians, they're not in the armed forces, they get to be combatants because they meet those rigid criteria. Does that apply to terrorist groups? Nope. No way. No, in World War II, the Germans hung French resistance fighters from street lamps because they were common criminals. And the law changed. Who said the law never changes? And the law changed. We said, that's just not right. By the way, here's a good review question for you. Even before Common Article 3. See, before Common Article 3, I couldn't point to any black letter law that said you can't just hang a civilian from a street post, even if they are fighting unlawfully. After Common Article 3, though, you see, can I do that? Why not? No, I can't, because Common Article 3 says you got to give all people under all circumstances, when you're taking an active part in hostilities, which would include the French resistance fighters, get due process rights under Common Article 3. So again, we fix that gap in the law post-World War II. Now this is really important. Here's the soundbite I want you to remember. When you're sitting at Thanksgiving and the annoying person shows up at Thanksgiving, like the annoying aunt you really wish wasn't there, or the whoever that you kind of wish wasn't there, and you swear you're coming, you say, I'm taking an Osher class, and they look at you sneeringly and they say, what a waste of your time. You're not learning anything. What a waste of your money. You swirl your cognac and you say, there's no such thing as a combatant in a non-international armed conflict. That's true. Combatancy is a concept exclusively reserved for conflicts between states. Why? Because if it's an armed conflict, it is an armed conflict, but it's a conflict between a state and some organization or some group of non-state actors, full criminal law applies. And you see this. If you don't believe me, I'll send you a dozen cases. Richard Reed, you may remember the shoe bomber? Richard Reed walks into federal court, and he looks a federal judge in the eye and he says, I'm a combatant, you may not prosecute me. What's the federal judge say? No, you're not. You're a common criminal. Sit down and shut up. Okay? Kawaja, case in Canada. The Canadians in Ottawa intercepted. They stopped in midstream a bomb plot. The Kawaja family is a really bad family, by the way. If your daughter brings home somebody named Kawaja, look a little deeper. Okay? The Kawaja family had sons scattered around the world, communicating from Canada, one branch, in London with the other, like literally in the middle of a bombing. Like the Royal Police rolled up as they're like getting in the cars with fuses and all that stuff. Kawaja walks into Canadian court and General District Court and says, I'm a combatant, you can't prosecute me. What's the Canadian judge say? No, you're not, you're a criminal. Full criminal law applies. Now you see the magic of this. Does full criminal law apply once you get combatant status? Why not? Because you can now have combatant immunity. Think what the world would look like if we gave Hamas the lawful right to kill people, or Hezbollah, or ISIS, or anybody else. Now we're getting it. All right. I saw a hand, his hand first, his hand, and her hand. I want to do this quick, though. I don't want a speech. I want a question. Yeah, the International Court of... The question is, what about so-called mixed conflicts? Whether it's Vietnam is an international armed... Afghanistan, international armed conflict. Right? When we go in, it's an international armed conflict between us and Afghanistan, but at the same time, there is a domestic insurgency with Taliban and other folks. Iraq, another example, Vietnam. It's a mixed concept. So there's parts of a conflict that can be a common Article III conflict, a non-international armed conflict. What makes it international is when the Viet Cong are associated with a state actor. You think they were connected to the North Vietnamese? In a sufficient level that meets, and the law here has evolved since the Nicaragua case back in the 80s. But it's very straightforward. Here's the legal principle for the degree of association between a state and a non-state actor necessary to make it a fully international armed conflict. There's a lot of law there. The law of state responsibility. But if you don't meet so if you meet that threshold, the entire thing is internationalized. If you don't, part of it is international, one body of law. The other part is remaining domestic, common Article III criminal law. Did I say you could ask? Do y'all want to? Do we vote for a follow-up? All right, go ahead. Right. Remember the... No, not even close. Remember that the keystone to all those 4 criteria, and I said this, but maybe it didn't get heard, is that you must meet all those 4 criteria and be incorporated into the official structure of a state armed force. In other words, at that point, you're acting as the agent of a state. So it's not just a question. And this is the media screws this up all the time. They'll say, oh, here are the criteria to be a combatant, and I can automatically, and it's just like Kawaja in Canada. Imagine if the terrorist wakes up one day, puts on a uniform, puts on a sign that says, I'm an Australian ISIS, walks into the bank, I'm carrying the bomb as an Australian ISIS, carrying my arms openly, fixed and distinctive insignia. In my pocket, I've got the Lion organization, and yes, I'm bombing a military target. I'm bombing the Pentagon or the Canadian Ministry of Defense. Does that make him a combatant because he's complying with those things? Not even close. Criminal, terrorist, go to jail. Now, quick follow-on in the back. Yes, sir. I was in the mountains of northern Iraq one time, and I happened to comment. At the time, I wasn't quite as culturally literate in that region as I am now, young and dumb, as they say. And I looked at the guy. He had a different headdress on, wearing a different... And I said, his was really cool, much cooler. Gold thread and all that. And I said, man, really cool. I like yours as opposed to these ordinary, boring ones that y'all can get anywhere. And he looks at me and he says, fixed and distinctive insignia. Like, excuse me, right? You're still an unlawful participant, but never mind that. Yeah, there's no limitation on that. As long as it's identifiable from a distance and you're carrying your arms openly. All right? She had the question. No, why not? Good question. Good question. So insurgents, non-state actors in Syria, are they combatants? Nope. Although, let's be clear, this gets back to your question. I don't have time to give you all the law here. I think today that conflict has been internationalized. So they weren't combatants just in terms of the black letter. The black letter law, we're there, folks. That today is an international armed conflict. But 2 years ago, rebels fighting Assad, he calls them terrorists. Is he correct legally? Yes, he is. But does that mean he can just do anything he wants to do? Drop barrel bombs on them? Execute them with no trial? Common Article 3 applies. Number 1, no violence, no torture, no cruel treatment, etc. Due process rights. But what else applies? This is important. This is a little bit of review. Remember that big gray arrow going back? All those targets. That's why Assad commits a war crime by dropping barrel bombs. Even though it's not an international armed conflict, the principle of distinction morphs back. The principle of proportionality morphs back. Okay? All right, good. Now we're getting somewhere. Here's the basic principles again. Now let me do targeting. There's proportionality. I showed you this last week. It's in your slide. I can't believe y'all didn't get slides. That just bothers me. Dadgum. We're going to fix that. Here's proportionality. And the big thing I wanted you to understand on this very quickly is, and then we're going to do a couple of practical exercises, is that notice when I showed you the tape, your instincts when you're seeing a fighter, a sniper looking around a corner, your instinct is to gauge proportionality just based on what you see. Right? I mean, that's okay. That's the understandable instinct. Guess what? Dead wrong on the law. Okay? In the law, we say proportionality is gauged by what's clearly excessive in relation to the concrete and direct overall military advantage. Remember, it's a strategic context. As long as I can articulate a military advantage, it may be that the military advantage is going to be realized in a different geographic location, even a different country, or a different time, or a different location, or in a different way. As long as it's concrete and direct, my military advantage does not have to be isolated just to that particular narrow context. Think about this. In Kosovo, when we bombed bridges in Kosovo, the Serbs came up and said, well, NATO's committing war crimes because they can only bomb a bridge when there's military equipment on there. What would you say? It's kind of a dumb rule. Now remember, we still got the proportionality. We still have to have only attacking lawful military targets. That's the definition of what a lawful target is. Assuming we meet those two things, though, how dumb is it? To say to an infantryman, you can only shoot back when you're being shot at. No, that's not the law. Okay? Neither is it proportionality. And then the big one, when we do human rights, we're going to do a whole week just on this issue. That last word, anticipated. The warfighter gets an appropriate degree of deference. Okay? And it's based on what you know, a lot of factors. We're going to do that in 2 weeks. All right. So here we go. Unlawful killing, I already talked about this. Combatants who are still combatants are always combatants. Therefore, they can be targeted just based on that status. When your transition changes, when you are killed or injured not on the basis of combatant activities, we call that murder. Okay? So we had a case in Panama when we had seized you remember in Panama there was a big fight over a dam, and the U.S. Army Rangers went in and seized the dam. And there's a warfighter who is down. He's bleeding. He's laying on the ground. And the fight's over. Smoke is clearing. Guy walks over, points his weapon at him, and just starts shooting. Okay? Question, what's the difference between and he was prosecuted. Now this is a trial. He's prosecuted for what? Murder. What's the difference between a lawful activity and an unlawful murder? What's the difference? Say that again. He had ceased to take part in the fight to all apparent observers. He's laying on the ground, the pool of blood is spreading, so he's no longer actively participating. In other words, he was a combatant. Now he is what? Oh, come on, you've seen this on MASH. He's either a prisoner of war, non-combatant, because he's in our custody, or he's sick and wounded. And if he's sick and wounded and out of the fight, what is he? A non-combatant. And if you kill a non-combatant, what is it? Murder. Okay? And his whole defense comes down to, I saw him reaching for a grenade. And if you believe that, what is it? A combatant, even a severely wounded combatant, but a combatant nonetheless, no problem. The guy was acquitted at trial. Controversially, I might add, because it was a mixed set of testimony. But then you see the legal issues. Okay? Question?
What about the
It was.
corpsmen
Corpsmen are sort of their own little category. Corpsmen and chaplains are their own little category. Technically, they're not combatants, they're not non-combatants, they're just non-participants. Even though if I'm a medical corpsman, what's the first rule when I go out to shoot somebody, or gather somebody up? Shoot back. That's what all the Vietnam medical corpsmen tell me, and we did it in Afghanistan too. So there's a trope here, the idea that a medevac helicopter can't be armed. Can you put and in theory, they're not participating in the fight, but can you put, for example, a machine, we don't do it, but could you put a machine gun on a medevac helicopter? So long as it's purely for self-defense, yes. So that medic always has the right to respond to somebody who's shooting at them in self-defense. What they don't have the right to do is to initiate and just become combatants, because they're not combatants. Everybody see that? Same with chaplains. Okay? Special categories. Here's the definition of a lawful target. You don't need to write this down, because I'm going to ensure, if I have to move heaven and earth, that you get this slides. Now, understand, where does this legal principle come from? It comes from the protocol to the 1949 conventions that is applicable to an international armed conflict. But even when I'm fighting that Viet Cong, this is the rule I apply. Even when I'm fighting ISIS, this is the rule I apply. Okay? Or Hamas, or Hezbollah, or the Israelis in Gaza Strip. Okay? These are the rules, because that's that big arrow flowing back to customary practice. All right, now, let's do a couple of exercises here. We're good on time. Remember that these things are always additive. And what do I mean by that? I mean that they always operate. You can't single one of these things out as the strand of it. Anybody have a sweater that you messed it up because you started pulling on a string? Right? And you think, well, I'm going to make this thing better. I'm going to keep pulling on this, and sooner or later it's going to break. No, it never happens. You always mess it up. I've learned just cut it. Okay? It took me 50 years to learn just cut it. Okay? Same thing with the law of war. If you begin to sort of disentangle and pull out one strand of it, you're messing up the entire body of law. My point is, understand distinction, proportionality, military necessity, unnecessary suffering, the rule, this rule about taking feasible precautions, the duty to warn. There's a specific principle that says you must warn if circumstances permit. You can't disentangle any of these things and say, well, I did fine. I complied with the principle of distinction, but the commander just did whatever he wanted to do and didn't take feasible measures. It's a war crime, or at least a technical violation of the law of war. See, they all operate in conjunction with each other. Proportionality in modern law really is at the apex of that pyramid. It's the pinnacle, really, of all these principles. So, let's do a practical exercise. You ready? This is Kunduz. This is the actual picture from the hospital in Kunduz that was destroyed by the United States. We've admitted doing it, so it's a U.S. airplane following NATO rules of engagement. I love the announcement, and it's just sort of common sense sanity check, which you see very little of in the media, by the way. This is the headline. A destroyed area of the Médecins Sans Frontières hospital in Kunduz. By the way, is the hospital a lawful target? No, you don't need me to tell you that. Your granddaughter could tell you that. Okay? and why? Because it doesn't make an effective contribution. It doesn't meet the definition of a military target I just put up, okay? Anything which by its nature, use, purpose, location makes an effective use, to the enemy's purpose. It's a protected target. Now, here's the headline. A destroyed area visible at first light the morning after the facility. Does that look like sustained bombing to you? That's just media spin, folks. That's not sustained bombing. Sustained bombing means you got rubble. So you got to look through these things with some common sense and some media spin. Setting that aside, that doesn't answer the larger, that's just an inaccuracy. The larger question is, was the targeting lawful and how was it done? And you've got to go through this matrix of proportionality and distinction and the duty to take all feasible measures to minimize or eliminate. So what are the rules of engagement? What are the mechanisms in place to limit damage, in this case to hospitals or to other civilian projects? And then the last, and we're going to talk in a few minutes about human shields. Do human shields change the calculation, and if so, how? Okay? So if we can get this to work, oh, and the duty to warn. Remember, the duty to warn says you always have the duty to warn when you're going to do something. This is paired now with the duty to take all feasible measures. So if I'm a commander, I might well say the feasible measure I chose to take was a warning. You see that? The Israelis in the West Bank, the Israelis in Gaza, for example, drop leaflets. They make cell phone calls. They have other tactical things they do to warn. That's Israeli commanders doing both of those at once. Yes, there's a duty to warn, and remember, you can't disaggregate these, the duty to take all feasible measures. You're doing them both at once. That's fine, so long as you do them. Or, unless circumstances don't permit, and you can articulate a reason why you didn't do those things. Everybody with me? Quick question, and then we're going to do our group exercise. Well, the technical language of the law says you must provide an effective warning. Okay? So I don't, there's no black letter, it has to be this language or that language, but, common sense says I will typically drop leaflets in that language. But as long as I'm doing something that is understandable to them in their circumstances, I think that qualifies. That's just Newton. Newton right next to the book of Jonah in the Bible. Just my opinion. There's a big debate about this, though. In the language of the ICRC, the Israelis have gotten a lot of criticism because effective warning means a warning that's complied with. In other words, if I warn and civilians don't leave, the ICRC takes that as a per se indicia of ineffective warning. I don't think you can go there. That's not what the law says. But that's one of the fights. All right, so everybody with me? Let's do our practical exercise. And if this doesn't work, I got another way to make it work.
ETA, we've got people walking out of the building right now, getting in the vehicle, so we need to speed up the timeline if we can.
We're going as fast as we can, crew.
Roger that, we're going as fast as we can.
Engineer copies. I think that might be the rectangle building.
True on wildfire, just to confirm, you're not cleared to fire until I tuck your eyes onto the...
Dadgummit. This room is not user-friendly. You're hearing it, but you ain't seeing it, so let me show it to you.
That rectangular-shaped building,
still not seeing it.
Suspected is a mosque at this point.
Copy. Not clear to fire until you have your permission.
Legal edge, you are to pressurize.
Thanks.
You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to do the unthinkable.
Tires in the air. Tapes rolling, crew.
Legal edge engineers, copy. Cool, we're putting them on the line.
Now, I promise you, I got here 15, 20 minutes early. Where'd that lady go?
He's in the area,
never
no
here
lights
when you
on
need
yet for anything.
And we did this, and it was working just fine, so you could see it.
Not standing by to slave to you. Give you up. HR.
Just on the east side of the road.
I was on the west side of the road, but...
Okay, TV's got a couple lights popped on and off.
Now let's do this again so I can show it.
ETA, we've got people walking out of the building right now, getting in the vehicle, so we need to speed up the timeline if we can.
We're going as fast as we can, crew.
Roger that, we're going as fast as we can.
The question for you is, does this comply with the law of war or not, and why?
I think that might be the
Three
rectangle building.
questions.
The true one, wildfire, just to confirm, you're not cleared to fire until I tuck your eyes onto that rectangular shaped building. Just to let you know, we suspect it is a mosque at this point.
Copy. Not clear to fire until we have your permission.
Legal edge, you are to pressurize.
Thanks.
Too loud? The reason I wanted to show this to you, the hospital attack in Kunduz, this is the same air platform. So when you keep reading about Kunduz, it looks just like this.
Legal edge engineers, copy. Cool, we're putting them on the line. Okay, TV's in the area, no lights on yet from anything.
Not standing by to slave to you. Give you up, HR.
Just on the east side of the road?
To the east-west, do you see those?
Yes.
If we do.
Got a vehicle moving out.
One of the vehicles is moving right now.
Yeah, you are clear to engage it.
Right.
We got
Clear to engage the
Stand
vehicle.
by, do not engage, do not just monitor.
Roger.
Okay, channel A is good. Bring it up channel B. Elevation.
John, you are now clear to engage the moving vehicle.
New nominals.
Clear to engage.
Any personnel around you see?
Stand by.
Yes, there are personnel. Clear to engage those also.
Affirmative.
Let's go.
Now this is an AC-130, exactly the same thing that was in the air over Kunduz that hit the hospital in Kunduz.
Hey, ready. Good shot.
Direct secondaries.
People running to the west.
Vehicles leave.
More movers in the vehicle and more people clear to engage all
It's
those.
an AC-130.
Copy.
Hey, ready.
Moving.
Good. Come back on those guys. There we go.
Yeah, another second.
Other people coming out of the mosque right now.
Hey, ready. Go for the vehicle.
Secondaries.
Nice secondary. Vehicles, people
Guys are
can't
going to
leave.
town, man. Personnel running. There we go.
Come on, box. There we go.
Lead them a little bit further. Ready, ready.
Going to that vehicle.
Fuel truck. Flares away, flares away.
Flares.
No joy load.
Okay.
Continuing.
Do you see those?
Yes.
If we do.
Got a vehicle moving out.
All right,
vehicle's
now your
moving right
question
now.
is, does that comply with the law of war or not, and why? What are the basic principles here? We're just slightly reviewing, and then I'm going to show you what a targeting process looks like, a deliberate targeting process. Somebody asked me the question in the back. I said this, but I don't know that it got heard. That's an AC-130, the exact same platform that hit the Kunduz hospital. So question, preliminary question, does that look like some random bombing campaign? Now you see how pinpoint that is? That's a cannon sticking out the side of that airplane with the hydraulics as that airplane flies around, and you saw how pinpoint that was. They're able to hit an individual walking across the ground. So this idea of just random sort of gravity bombs, the U.S. just sort of leveling, you look at it. That's what happened in Kunduz. Okay? There is a question in Kunduz that has yet to be answered, not relevant for your purposes, but the question is, an AC-130W model does have a couple of dumb bombs, okay? But if it was one of the older models, it was just like that with the pinpoint cannon. The bombs themselves, though, aren't dumb. They're laser-guided munitions. So in either case, you're targeting very, very precisely. My instinct says when you look at that picture of the Kunduz hospital, it was exactly that. That's artillery shells landed, okay? So, comply with the law of war or not? What are the basic principles? I don't know. I have not learned a thing, and we are wasting our time. All right, good. So we got combatants, we got participants, so therefore we're complying with what? Distinction. Good, I heard it. They said it was a mosque, so that's important. They said it's a mosque, so when they say it's a mosque, what are they doing? They avoid it, but more not just avoiding it. Anybody listen closely? They say, don't hit the mosque, and what? You are not cleared to fire. You may only fire when we tell you to fire. What's that sound like? That sounds like a commander taking all feasible measures to minimize or eliminate. So they're checking their research database, they're looking at, and this is, I think, one of the flaws what happened over Kunduz. To the extent that the Médecins Sans Frontières had, in fact, sent coordinates and said, this is a hospital, there's a flaw in the system where when they're checking to see, can we hit this place, there's a systematic disconnect that didn't get through the chain of command. So you might say it was a war crime because they opened up fire, assuming that there was that kind of restrictive rule from a commander. Therefore, it's a war crime because they opened up fire. Anybody think of any reason why they might lawfully have done that? Over Kunduz or even here? Well, it's not just that they didn't know. I agree, anticipated. Then the question is, what should they have known? Because I can still hold somebody as a war criminal when you knew or should have known. But what's the other issue? What gets you around this? You must always take feasible measures. You must always warn. May I remember it? Unless circumstances do not permit. So what would say, oh, whoa, I know this rule that says I can't shoot at that without the approval of some specific target controller. What would make me change that rule? That's right. Somebody's shooting and I don't have time and energy to do that because I always have the lawful, constitutional, human right, moral right, philosophical right to defend myself always under all circumstances. So you see, in Kunduz, if in fact they were taking fire, all bets are off. And that's the question. We don't know the timeline. And when they say sustained bombing, see, one of the reasons that's a trigger for me, when they say sustained bombing, that implies sustained fire, logically. Well, I don't know. So I'm quoted in the Guardian newspaper last week saying there are insufficient facts to allege an actual war crime here. Give me more facts, we'll make some legal determination. But you can't just say it's a war crime until you string together those relevant facts. Okay, now Mike.
Yeah, maybe I missed it, but how do we know that those guys weren't just leaving the mosque?
Good question. Civilian, good, excellent question, excellent question. How do we know those guys aren't just innocent, protected civilians leaving worship on a Friday afternoon? Well, sure, they got cars. I mean, I drive to church. I hope you drive to church, right? How do we know? We don't. Now, this is a good question. You don't know when some moron gets on CNN and says, Americans killing civilians, here's the tape. But remember, the commander has the duty to take all feasible measures to minimize or eliminate. So there's a whole bunch that's happened off screen that we know.
So they had intelligence.
They have to have. They have to have. They might have somebody on the ground. They might have somebody in that group. They might have been watching that place. They might have, heaven forbid, a spy. Who was it got hung up on spies last week? We might have, using our technology, not to say this is hypothetically possible, a drone flying overhead 24/7 that's listening in on their conversations. We might have the heat signature that shows them making bombs in that factory. Who knows? But it's important, even when we know that they're misusing the mosque, assuming they are, we didn't just target the mosque and say, oh, fine, no problem. See, now it's very subtle technical things. When you start to look at it with the law, what do we say? We say, target the vehicles, target the individuals, target the... No! Are they combatants? No. What are they? Terrorists, unprivileged belligerents, unlawful participants. And then here's your new phrase of the day, which we're going to get into next week. Civilians taking direct part in hostilities. That's technically what they are. Remember, Common Article 3 said civilians taking an active part. Who has it said the law never changes? The law changed. We said, what's active? Some of y'all are probably active in a Rotary Club. You pay your dues. And you carry a card and you do as little as you can possibly do. Because you just want to have it on your resume, right? And you're active in, well, technically, yeah, but you're not really, right? So we changed the law in the 1977 protocol and we said civilian taking direct part in hostilities, which is when we do drone law next week, we're going to get neck deep into that. What is direct part? What does that mean in detail? Because that's the dividing line. I mean, if you think of it in stages, you're a civilian, you're a non-combatant, you're fully protected under all times, all circumstances. Up the spectrum a slight bit, you're a civilian taking direct part in hostilities, meaning you're not a combatant. If you're a civilian taking direct part in hostilities, can you be convicted for that criminal activity? Sure you can, because you're not a combatant. Can you be targeted? Yes, because you're taking direct part in hostilities. We can do all kinds of stuff because you're taking direct part in hostilities, but at the same time, under modern law, your full range of human rights law still applies. We can't just do anything we want to do. Why? Because you're not a combatant. Okay? There's the trick. And then you become a combatant. It's an international armed conflict. And again, the legal ground shifts. We're going to do this next week when we do drones. I don't want to get too deep into it because we're going to do a bunch of it. Quick, Mike.
Okay, bring it back to the hospital. So what's the chronology? Somebody has intelligence that there's bad guys of some...
That's why we just happen to be loitering with it. You think we send AC-130 gunships over every mosque just to kind of be hanging out?
Okay, so there's intelligence that there are bad guys there.
Lots of bad guys. It looked like lots of cars, lots of bad
We
guys.
haven't seen the tape, but, you know, the gunships do their thing.
Right.
It just so happened to be a hospital and the bomb wasn't smart enough or it was too close to the hospital.
Well, that's the relevant question is,
there were some innocent people.
assuming they were taking fire, the relevant question is, did you target the location of the fire? Let's say yes. That's a very precise weapon. You see that? That's not just some very precise. So you would target that. Was there reason, because remember, you still have the duty to take all feasible measures to minimize or eliminate. Was there reason for you to have known that that was in fact a hospital? And therefore, did you do what was reasonable and appropriate under those circumstances? So if you're taking fire, if I called in on the hospital and I said, they took fire 30 minutes ago, from this grid, go take it out, you'd say, no, you can't do that, right? Especially when there's a presumption, and this is debatable, but the protocol in an international armed conflict says that there's a presumption in favor of it being a civilian place. So whether it's a hospital or not, we know it's a civilian structure of some sort. How do we know it's a civilian structure of some sort? Because it's not a military structure, right? No matter what it is, a hospital, a house, a Rotary Club meeting, an Osher gathering, who knows? Who cares? Because the question is it a lawful target? What makes it a lawful target? The presence, the use, the nature, use, purpose, location of the place. So there's some things by their very nature that are military targets. There's some things that are by their use at that time, being used. There's some things by their location makes it a bridge. The bridge over the River Kwai, right? If I want to seal them on one side of the river, no, Calais, World War II. Any World War II historians here? Calais, a lawful military target simply by virtue of its location. No question about that. Okay? Or purpose. A weapons factory, always lawful target. So you go through that rubric, and that's what you're doing. That's where that communication with the Fire Control Center becomes very important. You see? Because you're asking all of those questions in sequence, and you're asking them sometimes very rapidly when you have time. When you don't have time, you may very well simply be responding to fire in that instant. All right, a couple more questions, and then we're going to go off tape, and I'll pick up next week. I wanted to show you the targeting sequence, but I'll do it next week when we do drones. Yes, sir? There was. I mean, the press report was that there were Afghans directly in contact. General Campbell said it was the Afghans who asked for that direct fire support. Fine, but that doesn't change our responsibility. Not one iota. Same rule, same principle, just a question of who called in fire. The only slight issue there would be whether it was actually called in from the ground, doesn't matter by whom, or whether an AC-130 pilot recognized the threat and unilaterally decided, oh, there's a threat, I've got to deal with it. Slightly changes what should have been known, what was feasible, etc. Absolutely, absolutely. Much, much better to have eyes on target that can say, nope, nope. Now, the NGOs fight this. If we had said to Médecins Sans Frontières, take a NATO staff person to be a liaison in your hospital, what would the NGO have said? Oh, they're very pure. We're so pure, we're so high, we do not associate with the military, we're better than you. They would have absolutely said, no way, no how. You bet they wish they had somebody on the ground there. See? This is the way the real world works, folks. It's not easy, but I want to emphasize it's not a sporting match either. We're not talking about fairness. It's not about sport. It's not about fair. It's not about evenness. It's about what's right and what's lawful. Okay? Because it's a moral imperative. When you send somebody in with a military mission, you dang well better equip them to win. That means they got the ordnance, the training, the rules of engagement are correct, and the law is correct. If you do any of those things as a moral imperative, Newton, right next to the book of Jonah, says leave them home. Because their rules of engagement and their legal equipment is just as important as the helmet that they're wearing or the armor on the underside of that AC-130. All right, 2 more questions, and then I got an announcement. Yes, sir. Doesn't matter, actually. Yes, it does, but that's not the point. The point is it's our legal obligation irrespective of what they're doing, and this is actually a broader point. It also, remember I showed you jus ad bellum and jus in bello? Right, so the Germans committed aggression going into Poland. Unlawful war. Aggression. Aggression going into France. Would we then say, because it's an unlawful war, from its inception, there are no laws of war that apply to German foot soldiers? They can do anything they want? No. We'd say that'd be no, no, no. Important point. There's a disconnect not only between what the enemy is obligated to do and what we're obligated to do. It's our legal obligation. It's our moral obligation, irrespective of their conduct. There's also a bright line, fundamental disconnect between the legality of the initiation of hostilities and the application of jus in bello. So, put that in layman's speak. The law of war applies equally to all parties once they're in an armed conflict. Now, the fact that they choose not to comply with it, that's a bad thing, but it in no way lightens my obligation or my benefits. Does that make sense? Cool? It makes sense. May not make sense, but that's the rule. Okay? All right, one last question, then we're going to go off tape. Quickly. 2 seconds.
How many levels in the armed forces do they actually have to learn this stuff?
Oh, I'll show you rules of engagement next week. All the way down to corporal level, foot soldier level, squad level. But what they're not learning, this is important. This isn't actually her question. Everybody hear her question? How low do you have to learn this stuff? They're not learning. If I said, cite me Article 57 of Protocol 1, there's not a Marine on the planet that could do that. And I don't want them doing that. That's my job. Right? Your job is to be technically, tactically proficient. As we used to say in the good old days, move, shoot, and communicate. That's armor officer talk. Move, shoot, and communicate. Focus on your mission. Let me focus on the legal gobbledygook. You don't need me standing by your side to tell you you can't shoot a disarmed civilian. You don't need me to tell you to do that. It is the commander's job, and importantly, the commander's duty, the commander's obligation, to make sure that this stuff is understood and complied with all the way down to the lowest levels. As a moral matter, for me, when people say, that's why an American commander shouldn't investigate conduits, I say, no, because they're the ones responsible for complying and enforcing the law and in military discipline. You can't just take that out of their hands. You might as well tell a commander, you're not in command anymore. That's the functional equivalent of saying you're not responsible for complying with the law anymore. So, all right, camera off, sound off. I am going to ask you something.